For me, I find Alpine one of those brands which you kind of never know what they're going to do. They're so over the place, especially back in the day. They'd simultaneously have, take Gran Turismo's past for example, a couple of relatively unassuming, iconic but unassuming little classics. You got the A110, you got the more Renault V6 kind of generation car, which of course ultimately became one of their most famous models over the years, the GTA, that very similar shape. They're iconic for sure, and they're one of France's relatively few pure performance or pure sports brands. And they even go as far as being like Le Mans level machines, successfully in some cases, and certainly successful in the rally world, but they're still kind of easy, at least for me, and maybe this is just me, to sort of sleep on. Think of Alpine, you think, yeah, they're cool, they're cute, they're charming, they occasionally make a deceptively good car, but I still don't tend to have high expectations from them when it comes to driving a new one, which I guess is a me problem, because I should have learned by now that they make damn good cars. Now this one is actually a car which I've seen quite a few people, especially over the months after the game's release, and certainly when it, I believe, came around in the Legends dealership, I think it is every so often, to review this car, and I just never got around to it. It is of course the A220 race car from 1968. Looks very similar to like the A110 road car, but in more of a Le Mans kind of shape. Almost gives me like Chaparral Can-Am kind of vibes, like a little 2D. At least when I purchased this one, it was around 600 grand. Of course that can change, I'm sure it has by now, I haven't really looked. And in terms of the points, well, when I wrote down the specs, it was many months ago, so I'm sure that this has changed and I haven't double checked it, but it was 605 points stock. I'm certain that that has changed, probably quite notably since then, but it's still around that kind of region. Now that's quite hefty, not just for an Alpine, but for a 1968 little race car that isn't like an actual Chaparral or a Ferrari. That is quite a high point level. Around 600 is no joke. So what does it actually have to work with? Well, power-wise, it's quite a lot for its frame. And it's especially a lot when you consider just how light this actually is. 319 horsepower is what you're working with stock. But even more impressively, 690 kilos is all this car weighs. So the power to weight is fantastic on this thing, and suddenly it makes all the sense in the world that this would have a high point level. It kind of is like a little French Chaparral in a weird kind of way. Now of course it is mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, naturally aspirated, and for me one of the most curious things about this car is that they offer it with pretty bad tyres, at least to begin with. So I would say that if nothing else, I would strongly recommend putting it onto at least sports tyres before you make your final verdict and final decision on whether or not you like the car, because it makes such a massive difference that to me it can make all the difference. Now one of the key things that this could be useful for, as with many classics, is because it's so light, like the Mini Marcos principle, you don't need a huge amount of power. So if you reduce the power even by a hefty amount down to like 150, 160 horses, it's still less than a 700 kilo car. It's still mid-engine rear-wheel drive with a decent amount of downforce, and even if you have it on low-level tyres like softs, or even comfort if you have to, that could be a weapon. And in fact, that is one of the relatively few times where I have used this car in a quote-unquote career mode event, heavily reducing the power, keeping the weight nice and low, and it is properly quick. If you really want to get the best out of it, it goes without saying really, but even so, you do need to apply some changes here and there. It is quite a twitchy little car, and it's twitchy especially in response to tyres. Of course, tyres are going to make a massive difference to any car, road, race, whatever, especially though to classics, because what was good back then versus even sports tyres in the game now is a vast gulf. Put this thing on race tyres, you've got an absolute missile, but the points are going to go up like a skyrocket, and that balance, finding the best tyres you can possibly get for whatever point level you're working in, I would actually say is more important than getting the most power. Because with a car like this, if you can master the cornering, the straight lines will take care of themselves. You really don't need that straight line power, because when you can take corners like this thing can, with the right tuning, the right tyres, etc., you can more than make up for any lack of power. Ultimately for me, it didn't end up being a car that I used as much as I would have probably thought. To me, this definitely looks like the kind of car which I could have seen popping up in like Gran Turismo 4, one of those cars that you have like member berries or nostalgia for with those old PS2 graphics. Of course, that's not the case, this was its debut, but I could definitely see this being kind of like a current memorabilia in the making, if you will. Like, people will look back in the future at games like this, and if a car like this isn't continued, which I'm sure it will be into the next game, but maybe not beyond, I could see people having fond memories looking back at a car like this, because it is a bit more obscure, it is easier to forget about, it is less obvious, and yet it's this little rough diamond which you can do so much with when it's polished. For me, I don't tend to use Alpines that much at all, even the ones that are really good. I know a ton of people love the Group 1 machine or the Vision GT in general. Of course, the newer Shape A110 is a very good platform. I just don't find myself using them that often for whatever reason. They are great cars though, and this is no exception because this is such an unexpected little twist for the Alpine lineup in the game, and it's a pretty great little one to work with. Definitely reminds me of those eras from the small, super wide Alfa Romeo race cars and those squat down little Ferrari cars, you know, kind of Can-Am stuff, and it definitely fits in very well with that kind of era. It's just kind of a shame that this car doesn't seem to have too many really good rivals. There are some which you could maybe put up against it at a stretch, but nothing that feels quite suited to going head to head on their own terms. So maybe in the future we'll see more like that, like the late 60s and 70s, extremely small, super wide, chunky tyre, kind of open back end, exposed snake pit exhaust kind of era, which I personally think looks fantastic, and they're very raw in terms of driving them. So yeah, I know a ton of people love it. For me, it's not a car that I ended up using a huge amount, but I do like it, at least on the surface, and it does offer a hell of a lot to love and a hell of a lot to work with as well. So of course, stick around on the channel for more reviews and drop your thoughts on the car down below, either way, positive or negative. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.